Hey, what's going on, class? Let's make this online lecture short and sweet. So we're going to finish off just the last few slides of Tuesday's lecture on cellular respiration. I'll do a little itty-bitty review on it just so we're all on the same page. And then we're going to talk about we're going to get into chapter 5 and talk about climate change, global warming, and how photosynthesis might be involved in all that. All right, so a little review on aerobic cellular respiration. So this is the main metabolic pathway that makes ATP in most eukaryotic cells. So in most cells with nuclei, right? In most eukaryotes, when you think of eukaryotes, you should think of animals, plants, fungi, and protists, which are things like amoebas and single-celled eukaryotes. So these guys, eukaryotes, a lot of them do aerobic cellular respiration. So what aerobic cellular respiration does is it takes glucose, which you can see on the figure in the bottom left, the red molecule. It takes glucose and it breaks it down to convert all of the potential energy in glucose into potential energy of ATP. So this is like a currency exchange or a currency conversion. You're converting from glucose to ATP. They're both molecules that carry energy, but your cell only accepts ATP, much like Kroger here only accepts dollars and not Chinese RMB, if I remember right. That one was for Margaret out there. So it's all about converting the potential energy in glucose into potential energy in ATP. And it does this in 3 steps. All right, we're breaking down a ton of metabolic reactions that occur into 3 main steps. First one is glycolysis, where you break glucose down into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. The citric acid cycle, which happens in the mitochondria, and that takes these 2 pyruvic acid molecules and breaks them down even further. And then you have the electron transport chain and ATP synthesis, which is the last step, which makes most of the ATP in this pathway. So this is the money maker. So with glycolysis and citric acid, you're not making a lot of ATP. The main reason you go through these 2 steps is to convert the energy in glucose into NADH. NADH, we saw it there, like the little taxi cabs there in the red box. They are electron shuttles, so they carry electrons, and what they're going to do is they're going to dump their electrons onto the electron transport chain to power it. All right. So these 2 steps, glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, convert the potential energy of glucose into potential energy in NADH, this electron carrier. So electron transport, the chain lives in this little inner membrane of the mitochondria. And what it is a bunch of enzymes. It's a series of enzymes that pump protons, hydrogen ions basically, across the inner membrane to create a concentration gradient. And the energy they're using in order to pump these protons against their concentration gradient, so they're taking it from an area of low concentration to high concentration, that energy comes from the electrons in NADH. All right, and if you look at this figure down here, you can also see, if you follow the electrons that NADH is dropping off at the electron transport chain, follow that red arrow, eventually those electrons need to be dumped out somewhere. Those electrons don't just disappear, right? They have to go somewhere. So in order to keep those enzymes clear, and so that they can accept more electrons, you have to dump out those electrons somewhere, and that's where oxygen comes in. So oxygen is the main electron acceptor, the final electron acceptor of this pathway. So without oxygen, you wouldn't be able to keep that flow going. And this is key, right? This is why you breathe. That's what's crazy about this. You breathe so that you can get oxygen into every single cell, into every single mitochondria, so that it can accept those electrons from the electron transport chain. And in the process, once oxygen receives those electrons, it can interact with hydrogen ions to form water. All right. And in the end, a lot of talking on this slide, I'm sorry, but again, this is just review, so please go back to the lecture slides that are on Blackboard if you need to go over this, and read your textbook too. But in the end, the hydrogen ion gradient that's created, those hydrogen ions want to diffuse through the membrane, but they can't because they're charged. And the lipid bilayer, that the inner membrane is a lipid bilayer, and the lipid bilayer will not let these hydrogen ions go through. So they can only go through a protein channel, and that's that weird looking enzyme on the right. It's a molecular machine, and as the hydrogen ions go through that, it actually powers that ATP synthase enzyme to make ATP. And this is where 90% of the ATP is made, right there. Okay. Now, that was all how your cells make ATP using oxygen. So what happens when there isn't oxygen? And this happens, there are environments that have no oxygen but can sustain life. So how do cells make ATP without oxygen? They can do this with anaerobic respiration. And this is something your book doesn't explain super clear, so hopefully this clears it up for you. It's exactly like aerobic respiration. Not exactly, but it's very, very similar to aerobic respiration. But the main difference is that it uses an element other than oxygen as that final electron acceptor. So it can use sulfur, nitrogen, etc. This is a lot of what those, there's deep sea vents and that are super hot and have no oxygen. There are bacteria that live there, and they do this. They use the sulfur that come out of those deep sea vents as their final electron acceptor to do anaerobic respiration, because there's no oxygen there. Another metabolic pathway, so that's one. Another metabolic pathway cells use in the absence of oxygen is fermentation, and this you might be familiar with. But basically, what you might not know is that fermentation is simply glycolysis, which is the first step in aerobic respiration, coupled with a reaction that replenishes NAD+. Don't worry about that second part. I'll explain that later. So what are examples of fermentation in the world, everyday world around us? Muscle cells do fermentation after they've run out of oxygen and then release lactate as a byproduct. So when you do a bunch of exercise, and you specifically aerobic exercise, and you burn through the oxygen available in your body and your system, when they're outpacing how much oxygen you can replenish, they're going to start doing fermentation in order to get ATP. Because remember, you always have to ask yourself, what are we looking at here? And what we're looking at is ways that cells can make ATP without oxygen. So when your muscle cells run out of oxygen, they can make ATP using fermentation. Same with yeast. Yeast can do fermentation, and when they do, they release CO2 and ethanol as a byproduct. So let's look at these two super quick. So during intense exercise, muscles run low on oxygens, and so they can't do cellular, or they can't do aerobic cellular respiration. So then glycolysis kicks in to make ATP. So here you see on the right, bottom right, glucose is being broken down into 2-pyruvates or 2-pyruvic acids, same thing, essentially, by glycolysis. And you're making 2 ATP that way. Remember, not a lot of ATP compared to aerobic cellular respiration, but it's some. And if you remember, we also said that glycolysis makes some NADH as well. So you can see there that NAD+, which is the empty electron shuttle, picks up 2 electrons and a hydrogen from glycolysis to become NADH. So you actually need NAD+ in this reaction. It's required in order to do glycolysis. So once glycolysis kicks in, it's going to start using up the free NAD plus, and you're just gonna you can after you've used up NAD plus, you can't do glycolysis anymore. So in order to replenish NAD plus, your muscle cells do fermentation. So fermentation takes the two pyruvic acids and turns them into two lactic acids, or I'll follow what's on the slide, two pyruvates, and turns them into two lactates. You'll see that the reaction from pyruvate to lactate, you're using the NADH and making NAD plus that you can now use for glycolysis. So really all fermentation does is it's trying to replenish NAD plus so that you can keep this reaction going. So you can do more glycolysis and make at least a little bit of ATP. And that's why your muscles fill with lactic acid. So it's a myth that muscle soreness comes from lactic acid buildup. Muscle soreness actually comes from you tearing muscle. So just because your muscles are doing fermentation, that's not why your muscles are sore at the end of the day. All right, so let's look at fermentation in microbes. Yeast is awesome, and I'll tell you why in a second. But in the absence of oxygen, so yeast can use oxygen to do cellular respiration, but when there's no oxygen, they're going to use glycolysis, just like your muscle cells, to make ATP. And they're going to use fermentation, just like muscle cells, to replenish the NAD+, so you can keep doing glycolysis. Yeast, though, release CO2 and ethanol as a byproduct, and it's just super important. So if you didn't know this already, yeast fermentation is used to make wine, beer, and bread. Very important commercial products in today. Once you become of drinking age, a glass of wine is actually pretty nice. And bread has to be one of the most fantastic inventions of man ever. I love bread. There's certain bacteria that can also do fermentation, and they produce lactate just like your muscle cells as a byproduct. And one of these bacteria, L. acidophilus, is the one that's used to make yogurt, cheese, and sour cream. So also fermentation, another example of how fermentation matters in our everyday life. All right, one final note about metabolism. This is really interesting. This is from your textbook, and I thought this was cool. So answer this question for me. Which BMI classification is associated with less mortality than being normal weight? So BMI stands for body mass index. We didn't look at this in class, but it's in your textbook. I'm not going to test on the BMI thing, but this is more for your benefit. So BMI is talking about the fat to muscle ratio. So if you're of high BMI, that means you have a high fat to muscle ratio. It basically, if you have high BMI, you're overweight or obese. All right, and then low BMI, low fat to muscle ratio, and you're considered, if you're on the low end, you're considered underweight. So you would think that having a normal weight, an average BMI, would be good for you, right? But actually, studies have shown, studies have seen a correlation, and remember, correlation does not mean causation, but they've seen a correlation between one of these BMI categories listed here, underweight, overweight, moderate obesity, or severe obesity, a correlation between one of these and less deaths than being average weight. So which one is it? All right, I would have thought A, right? Being underweight, if you're underweight, there are less deaths than being normal weight. But actually, it's overweight. The people that are overweight correlated with less number of deaths compared to normal weight. So I'm probably, if I'm totally honest, overweight. For my height, I weigh a little more than I should, according to the BMI chart that's on your textbook. But hey, that's okay. because apparently I might live longer than some of you guys that are normal weight. But this is true. It's crazy. I don't really get how that is, but it's a scientific study that's been done. So here again is the BMI, the relative health risk, and the BMI. So if you're, this is just talking about BMI. If your BMI is less than 18.5, you're underweight. And then you have normal weight, overweight, moderate obesity, and severe obesity. So if you look at the relative risk of each of these BMIs, you'll see that the lowest risk is, so basically number of deaths, is the overweight. So overweight people, which is not obese, but it's slightly above the average BMI, the overweight people are going to be subject to less deaths, a lower mortality. Very interesting. Your textbook talks a little bit more about it if you want to look at it, but we'll end our lecture here. One thing I do want to mention is that for our test, I'll announce this on Tuesday after fall break, we're going to calculate what our basal metabolic rate is, how many calories you burn just by sitting there. And that way you can actually calculate how many calories you should be consuming. And that we're going to do that, and that's actually going to be part of the exam score, the grade for the exam. So in this exam, we'll do it a little differently, but that exercise is going to factor into your exam score. So we'll talk about it on Tuesday after fall break. All right, let's transition to Chapter 5. We'll begin with looking at Sections 1 and 2, Climate Change and Photosynthesis. Let's look at a little overview of Chapter 5. So Section 1 deals with the greenhouse effect, and we're going to be looking at what the greenhouse effect is, what it's caused by. Then the second section is about the flow of carbon on our Earth, so how carbon flows from CO2 in the air to carbon in living things. The carbon that you're made of actually came from CO2 in the air, believe it or not. And we're going to be looking at questions such as, is global warming for real? Is it a real thing? Section 3 is actually about photosynthesis, and your textbook tries to spin this and connect the two by asking the question, can photosynthesis slow down global climate change? Because photosynthesis uses CO2, right? And CO2 is thought to cause global warming. So we're going to look at photosynthesis, what it is, making sugar from sunlight. We're going to look at why photosynthesis matters and how plants actually make sugar from sunlight. And then in the last section, which we'll just touch on very briefly, we'll talk about how plants cope with excessive heat. So if the trend is that temperatures on the earth are increasing, so how are plants coping with that increase in temperature? Today's lecture will cover 5.1 and 5.2 and give a little introduction to photosynthesis. So what is a greenhouse effect? A greenhouse effect happens when greenhouse gases in the atmosphere trap energy from the sun. So basically, you can see here in the figure, the sunlight, which is a ton of it, goes through our atmosphere and hits the earth, and it warms the earth. All right, you can feel this if you touch concrete or the road, asphalt, it's absorbing heat, and same with land, just dirt. So as that heat is reflected from the earth, so the earth absorbs the heat and then it basically radiates it back. As it's radiating it, it warms up the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So there's a layer of gases in our atmosphere that have CO2, water vapor, methane, and they're collectively called the greenhouse gases, because what they do is after they are warmed up, they then release that heat back to the earth. So it's almost like they suck up heat that's radiated from the earth and then radiate it back to earth. So it warms up the earth, and this is a good thing. Otherwise, the earth would be too cold to sustain life. So if it wasn't for greenhouse gases, God wouldn't have been able to, or of course he would have been able to, but God likes order and he likes consistency. So life itself wouldn't have been sustainable because the earth would be too cold. And there would be no beach days, all right, and that would suck. So greenhouse gases are good, but too much of a good thing is never good. And this is what's happening. Too much greenhouse gases. All right, but the greenhouse gases are good, right? The earth warming up is good so it can sustain life. But how does the surface of the earth cool down? And that's bodies of water. So bodies of water help maintain temperature on the earth constant. If not, it would fluctuate. It would heat up too much, and then it would probably cool down too much at nighttime, for example, when there's no light, no energy from the sun. So what they do is bodies of water absorb heat energy during the day as energy that is used to break hydrogen bonds. So remember we went over this in chapter 2 when we were looking at the properties of water. Water molecules form hydrogen bonds with each other, and when water is applied heat, that heat is first used to break the hydrogen bonds, and then it's used to increase the temperature of the water. So that's why it takes so freaking long to get that water to boil whenever you're wanting to boil an egg or make some pasta. So this action of water, that it absorbs heat energy, counteracts the greenhouse effect, and it helps maintain a life-sustaining atmospheric temperature. So let's briefly look at the water cycle. So as water warms during the day and it's absorbing heat, eventually it will raise temperature a little bit, and the water on the very top of the ocean on the surface is going to evaporate. That evaporated water is going to be collected in clouds, and then as the atmosphere cools, that water is going to condense and descend on land as rain. And then that rain eventually will find its way back into the ocean, and the cycle will continue, right? And that is a water cycle. And so it's cool because that's why water doesn't just disappear when it evaporates. It comes back around. And so there's this cycle that's constantly helping maintain the earth temperature pretty constant. All right, so now the question, is global warming for real? True or false? Most scientists disagree that global warming is occurring. This is false. Actually, global warming has become a pretty well-accepted theory in the scientific community. So no longer just a hypothesis, but a theory, because there is a lot of evidence from a lot of different angles to support it. So I'm honestly not very aware of how the idea that global warming is not occurring, how that idea got traction, but somehow it did, and now there's a lot of people confused about it. But scientifically, it seems to be that the Earth is getting warmer. So first things first, global climate change is undeniable. So this climate change is just local changes in average temperature, precipitation, and sea level relative to historical conditions, so to what those conditions were in the past. And this is undeniable. The climate is changing, all right? Everyone can agree on this. But now the question is climate change linked to an increase in greenhouse gases? And the reason we ask this is because the levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide have increased over the past 50 years. So we're able to actually measure historical CO2, atmospheric CO2. And you can see on this graph, you have on the y-axis CO2 concentration, and on the x-axis time in years. So from 1960 to 2010, it's risen pretty steadily. And you can see that it fluctuates. You have these little dips and raises, and that's simply because of seasons. So during the winter, photosynthesis is suppressed and plants aren't absorbing as much CO2, so there's a little spike. And then the summer, plants come back to life and absorb CO2, and then there's a dip, and so on and so forth. But the average concentration is steadily increasing. So the question is this a normal pattern in the atmosphere? We can be looking at this, but maybe this has happened before, right? So we can actually look at ice cores from the Arctic and Antarctica, and an ice core is simply pulling out a tube of ice that is miles deep that contains ancient air. And you can look at that ancient air, and via using very sophisticated science, you can actually come up with what the CO2 concentration was hundreds of thousands, if not more, years ago. And so you can look at CO2 levels, and you can also look at temperature levels based off of other gases in that sample. And you can see that atmospheric that the global temperature that's shown in blue in this graph is positively correlated to CO2 levels. So every time there is a spike in CO2, there is an increase in temperature. And then as CO2 decreases, temperature decreases, right? So it seems like CO2, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is directly correlated with the temperature. And now we know this as the greenhouse effect. So we can look at the greenhouse effect historically. And you can see that there have always been increases and decreases, increases and decreases. And the Earth has this like 100,000 year cycle, basically. So maybe we're just at the beginning of another 100,000 year cycle. Could be. But the current CO2 levels are at the highest level in over 400,000 years. So we have never been able to see CO2 levels as high as they are now. And so if CO2 has never been this high, that means that soon temperature is going to follow. And we're going to see higher temperatures than the Earth has ever seen, or the Earth has seen in the last 400,000 years old. So the question is, what is contributing to this increase? What is contributing to these highest levels of CO2 that we've seen in the last 100,000 years? To understand that, we have to understand the carbon cycle, or the flow of carbon. So this is section 5.2 in your textbook. And carbon is naturally released into the atmosphere, usually as it escapes from volcanic activity. There's CO2 in the Earth that is released when volcanoes erupt, and also as all living organisms that breathe exhale, right? And they're going to exhale CO2. And so that CO2 rises and collects in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas. And then plants will come along and take up CO2 from the atmosphere using photosynthesis. And this is something amazing that happens. What they do is they take an inorganic form of carbon, CO2, and use it to make an organic form of carbon, glucose, that other organisms can consume. And this is called carbon fixation. It fixes carbon into the living ecosystem. This is huge. That's why in the beginning of this lecture I said that you are made up of carbon that came from carbon dioxide, because ultimately the organic matter that we're made of comes from what we eat, right? We consume carbon so that we can grow. As a baby, you're consuming foods and consuming carbon so that your body can make more organic macromolecules such as proteins and lipids and carbohydrates to make more cells and to make you grow, right? That food that you eat, now we're making it in labs, but back in the day, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that food was coming from the earth. That food was coming from animals that were eating plants that made sugar from CO2, that used the carbon and carbon dioxide to make a carbon source we can eat and be fed from, glucose, right? And so again, the carbon in your body comes from CO2 in the air that has been fixed by plants. All right, so we've seen that historical global temperatures follow atmospheric CO2 levels. Right now, we're undoubtedly in a period of drastic global warming because the CO2 levels are spiking, and we know that temperatures are going to follow. And this is agreed on by published scientists. And this is what we call global warming. And so global warming is a reality as far as we understand. As the relation between CO2 and temperature, the Earth is going to continue to get warm. And this is a consensus amongst most scientists. There's some that disagree, just like there are people who disagree about everything. Everything has no one agrees 100% on anything, right? Um, even the Earth being round, there are people today that believe the Earth is flat. I'm serious. Look it up on Google. Flat Earthers, they are out there. So not even the most obvious thing, there are going to be people that disagree with. So even with global warming, there are scientists that disagree with this theory. And again, scientists agree that this is caused by the increases in greenhouse gases, mainly water vapor, CO2, methane, and ozone. And most scientists agree that this is mostly attributed to human activities. So not only is global warming real, but most scientists agree that global warming is due to increase in greenhouse gases because of how we live. So the drastic increase in CO2 over the last 50 years is positively correlated with an increase in fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are fuels like petroleum, coal, and natural gas. They're fuels that come from literally fossilized organic matter. So as things die, plants and animals, they're all organic carbon organisms, and they're going to get compressed under layers of rock, and eventually all of those organisms are going to become petroleum under the earth that all these oil companies are drilling for. And they're going to become coal that are used in coal power plants like the one on the right. I think that's a coal power plant. And natural gas, which is the least hazardous of the two because it releases the least amount of CO2. So as you burn these fuels, they release CO2. So if you think about it, the world runs off of electricity now, and the world is booming as far as population. So in order to sustain the electrical needs of all these people, we're burning more fossil fuels than ever before. So the spike in CO2 levels that we're seeing now, we're not even done with it. I'm sure that's going to continue to just rise and rise and rise because of the amount of fossil fuels we're burning up in order to power our lives. So thus we are contributing to global warming. All right, it's not a myth. We really are contributing to global warming. Our lives of excess are contributing to global warming. The fact that a lot of Americans have multiple cars and they drive everywhere and they're constantly buying clothes and items and consuming so much, because remember, the stuff we buy, the electronics, the clothing, the plastic items we consume were made using fossil fuels to power their making, right? So our use of our consumerism to power our homes and our cars and businesses and the stuff we buy is releasing carbon dioxide that had been deposited for millions of years and locked safe away under the crust, under the surface of the earth, is now being released as we burn it all in order to power our lives. So we have to do something about that. So here's a few ways that you can do something. Are you interested in learning more? Watch the documentary called Chasing Ice on Netflix. I recommend this one because it's on Netflix and because I know a lot of you have Netflix, and if you have it, then you can watch this for free. It's a breathtaking movie that shows the effects of global warming on glaciers. So this is kind of like giving you real life, tangible evidence of how global warming is real and it's affecting our world in ways that we have never seen before. Another good one is Rent an Inconvenient Truth. It's a good documentary that, although very biased toward global warming, it definitely is biased. There is truth in there. There is or there are there's real data and real research in there that is very eye-opening. So watch these documentaries, read books on global warming, inform yourselves, and I think you're gonna be very surprised at how much evidence there is out there for global warming. And what can we do about it? Well, we'll be calculating our carbon footprint for part of our test grade for this unit. So besides calculating what our basal metabolic rate is and how much calories we need to consume per day so we can all be in the know of how much to consume food-wise, we're also going to calculate our carbon footprint. Your carbon footprint is how much you contribute to the CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So there's a nifty little website that we're going to be using to calculate each of our carbon footprints. And then you're going to be encouraged to pick out 2 or 3 ways that you plan on reducing your carbon footprints. Okay, and with that, we'll end. Don't want to go over into the 40-minute range, so we'll pick up with photosynthesis on the Tuesday after fall break. Enjoy your fall break. Do something fun, even if you don't go out of town, even if you don't have plans. Do something you would never do. If you haven't been to White Rock Lake, go to White Rock Lake. Go for a jog. This is a freebie. At White Rock Lake, you can rent out kayaks if you go to the north part of the lake. It's on the northeast part of the lake. There's a little kayak trailer, and you can rent a kayak and go kayaking on White Rock Lake, or go to the farmers market on Saturday in downtown Dallas. Do something fun, and enjoy. Get rest. Be refreshed. Enjoy God and worship with the saints. And I will be seeing you guys on Tuesday after fall break. Adios.